Well, my clock just hit 2 p.m. Eastern Time, so let's kick this thing off. Thanks for joining us. Today's webinar is about the fundraising technology landscape, and more specifically, how data tells the stories that your CRM can't. And we're going to spend time just looking at the different technologies and what the CRMs do and what these warehouses, in-memory marts, reporting, visualization, all the stuff you put in front of it can do. And we'll have a framework and a topology. I'm Doug. I'm your host. I lead a company called Advisor Solutions. We're a business intelligence analytics company. We do a lot of work in fundraising and both higher ed and also healthcare and not-for-profits, and have a couple hundred clients, mostly U.S., some in other parts of the world. You'll have my contact information at the end, and feel free to contact me. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll have it up and posted and announced in a couple of days. So, high level, you got a lot of data, and often it gets complicated. I would proxy that at a high level, there's only a few things that matter. You need to understand, the wealth of the capacity of your prospects, how attached or how engaged they are, and these are things that a lot of data weaves into. But if you have high capacity, highly engaged prospects, and then you thirdly know their interests, you can do a lot with it. For example, some of them are going to be great prospects. They've got wealth, they've been coming to your events, they've been giving regularly, they've come to reunions, they've been involved in your hospital in productive ways or whatever. And you know that they're interested in neuroscience, for example, and you're doing development in that area. So they'd be a great prospect. Others will fall a little lower and not be as good, and others, may not make your cut for whatever the program is. You also, from this, can learn how to message. In annual giving, knowing these things, especially interest, gives you clues as to what kinds of messages to send, what the theme should be, what the proper venue is, and if it's major giving, it also helps you understand what the campaign purpose and ask should be. And obviously, there's a bunch of other dimensions here about how you're approaching the prospect, whether it's annual giving or major giving, like how frequently connecting, all that. That's another part of it. But here we're focusing on prospects. I would proxy these three things really can help you tune your program and get improved and really great results out of it. So we're going to start looking at systems. Most of you have CRM systems that have a lot of the data you need to answer those kinds of questions. The major ones are Razor's Edge, Blackbaud CRM, Agilon, Advanced, Banner, Colleagues, Salesforce is coming more into the mainstream, and there's a bunch of other ones out there. But generally, they all do the same thing. They let you put data in a reasonably efficient way, and they store it in a database. And usually the database is either Microsoft SQL Server or Oracle, or there's some other versions out there, but those are the two dominant ones. And they have information. These little squares represent tables on the people, name, address, some biographical data. You might have employment. You've got gifts. Your giving history is clearly in there. What events have been attended are often in the CRM, but not always. Usually there's some data on wealth because you've done wealth screenings, or you can load in data on wealth by zip or something. There's sports, student activities, and so forth. So there's a bunch of data in here that describes the people and can be used to answer questions about capacity and attachment and interest and so forth. Then there's another bunch of data, other data. Some of the industry analysts have called this the dark data because it's actually often not in a system. It was never designed for analysis, but it's really useful. In the healthcare side, patient encounters is not in the fundraising system, but it's all the detail on the person or the family member's experiences with the provider. And these are highly predictive of potential to give, because some experiences create high bonding in connection and interest, and others don't. I mean, extreme examples would be I go in with a broken nose, I probably don't have a lot of connection. If I go in and I tore up my knee and my knee gets repaired in some complex new surgery, I'm highly more likely to be interested in supporting the institution. The call center, it's a bunch of data on approaches and what messages work. Click-throughs of newsletters is really valuable because it's a measure of if somebody's clicking on your newsletter, how interested they are, and they're also telling you what they're interested in by what they're clicking on. So this is data that would come from whoever it is that sends your newsletter out. They keep all of this at the click-through level. Usually it comes in a separate table. It might be a text file, it could be an Excel data sheet, might be in another database table. Sometimes it's put in the CRM system. Then there's surveys. Most of you do some kind of surveys. These can be mined if the questions are structured well to figure out relationships. You can also use these to figure out interest areas. These don't get used as much as they should, but if they're structured well and there's a good connection in higher ed between alumni relations and advancement, these can be highly useful. Social media is a hot topic, but quite honestly, we find a lot more value in some of the things that you would be able to collect and do internally than the social media, but this is a part of the equation. Wealth screens, wealthy zip codes, there's a bunch of other stuff that comes in. So this is a picture of a lot of data, not all in one place, not all in one system, but generally in some electronic form. So to turn it into useful information, which this is going to be the framework for the rest of this talk, there's three basic things you need to do. You need to access and blend the data together because as separate tables are not particularly useful or interesting. You need to synthesize and model it, structure it, create new metrics out of it, bin it. Then you need to have outputs that deliver it to your team in appropriate ways for them to consume it. So before we move on and talk about these front-end technologies, I just want to make a point that these CRM systems are generally really good for getting stuff in, but they're a lot harder to get stuff out of, and this comes up all the time. What often happens is, somebody decides that these are hard to work with, so they decide to consider changing the CRM, which is a rough decision because you're ripping up all the underlying infrastructure and all the entry procedures, and the whole team has to learn new tools, and it usually takes a couple of years, 2 to 3 years often, and it really can be quite disruptive. These front-end systems can actually really help out because they take the data that these CRM systems and other sources are creating and help the team see the stories in it and make it really easy to get the stuff out, the lists, the reports, the slicing and dicing that you want to do to take action. So that's what these front ends we're going to be talking about are really good at. And, they can extend the life of a CRM. So if you are considering changing the CRM system because you're having trouble working with it, can't see the data but you want in the way you want it, consider putting a front end on it. And we've got quite a few clients who have done that and extended the life of the CRM and deferred the painful change for a year, 2 years, some cases 3 or more. The other thing I'd point out is by putting the front end system in on top of the CRM, you understand the data, you understand what's useful, what creates stories, what helps you take action. So it helps you better plan for a CRM system change because you understand what's the current content that's useful and what needs to be ported over and how. So let's just step through. I'm going to step first through data access and blending, then synthesis and modeling, then outputs, and look at some examples of use and also misuse. So there's two major ways of accessing and blending data. The first, most of you are probably aware of, it's called a data warehouse or a data mart. These are database-centric. There's a bunch of providers. They take the raw data in these source tables, structure it, bin it, group it. We've pre-structured frameworks, comprehensive, one version of the truth. They're fairly heavy. They take a lot of setup time. There's a lot of kind of back-end wiring that has to go into these things, but they're great for taking, single truth enterprise-wide so everybody has access to this one version of the truth versus trying to pull it out and combine it out of all these source tables. Another kind of technology for data access and blending has evolved, and it's actually what we at Advisor do. It's called an in-memory mart. So these tend to be faster and more flexible. Basically, the difference is up here, you're bringing data in and you're structuring it in preset ways and paths to get more structured output. An in-memory mart pretty much plops all the tables you're loading into memory somewhere. It could be on a server in the cloud, it could be a server on premise, it could be your desktop. But the tables are all there, and then on the fly, you're interacting with the data and it's spinning and pivoting, and a selection on, say, the giving table, people who gave over $1 million. In RAM, it tells you who those people are. Then it goes in the appeal sends table, lights up which appeals they got. So now you know which appeals the people who gave over $1 million got. It's that dynamic flexibility that makes these in-memory marts really valuable, and that's fundamentally different than what a data warehouse or mart. They're not designed to do that. They're designed to get reports out, structured, consistent, pixel perfect. These things are also great for analysis, slicing and dicing data, exporting lists, because you're trying to pivot through, take this and this and this. I want my list of 10,000, go mail to them. They would be described as lighter. They generally go in faster. They're easier to modify and change. And they generally have a departmental or problem focus. Because of this analytics, you tend to be getting the data in forms for specific problems versus structuring up one truth for an entire enterprise to look at. But they're two complementary and different kinds of technologies. These basically run in a database. These run in RAM. There's a whole bunch of providers that have either one of these. We happen to be an in-memory provider. And then all of these can be set to load on a schedule. So typically, you don't want these data access and blending things banging on the database in the middle of the day when everybody's using it and all these people are writing into it. It's really busy. So usually they're set to load on a schedule at night after a backup window. Either one of these can do that. And so basically you're getting daily updates pushed out to your team. Either one can also set to be a load on demand. The memory mart's a little bit more flexible at doing that and would be more normal, but the mart or the warehouse can also be set, but you normally wouldn't do that. And also, either one can save prior versions, depends on what the store format is. The in-memory mart's probably a little easier at saving prior versions, and it sets up the ability to look at kind of, here's where we are today, September of 2017. Let me grab the one from September of 2016. How is my portfolio advanced? Do I have more later stage prospects? Are my close ratios better or worse? Those kinds of things, because often you want to look at how have we progressed over a year. So the beauty of having a snapshot, you can go back in time and see exactly where you were at that point in time. So this gets the data out. It integrates all of these things together. And I actually think I put these little lines down here to show the in-memory mart is probably a little bit better at flexibly grabbing other tables that come in on the fly. You don't need a DBA. It's not an IT-centric thing. It's more of an end-user analyst thing. So with the mart, if you get the click-through data, you can load it in and see if it has any bearing on attachment versus events or the other things you already have. So now you've got the data. You now have to do some work on it. We call that synthesis and modeling. So there's a bunch of metrics calculations which somebody somewhere does. Numerics pretty straightforward. An example would be, I don't know, maybe giving equals hard credit plus pledge commitments minus pledge payments. That's just a calculation you can do in the giving table based on the codes, and you can figure out what the current period giving is if that's what you want. There's a bunch of string calculations. Probably two examples of those are, we do a lot of work with events and also employment titles. So for example, if you get employment titles in from whatever the provider is, they usually run the gamut. They're entered all kinds of different ways. Vice president may be spelled 6 ways, and maybe VP, maybe vice president of advancement. Having like 6,000 titles probably isn't very helpful, but you can match out using string calculations on the text, different words that VP or vice or whatever, group them all into senior management and then middle management and staff or whatever. So you can create matched groupings by doing string calculations on a field like title. You can also create different combinations. So we do a lot of work where we have, say, in healthcare, patient encounters data from one system, and then we have advancement data from another system, and there's no real matching key between them. And so you could do things like take the last name, take the major word in the street address. You don't want to have street because it could be spelled street or ST or whatever. Take the zip code. So now you've got a combination of different strings from both tables that can match. Now you can link the tables together. So that's another example of a string calculation. Date calculations, I don't know. I want to know how many gifts have been made in the last year. And everybody's made a bunch of gifts. So you can use a date from now, go back a year, count up how many gifts have been made. Or has there been a contact in the last 6 months? That would be a date calculations. Logical might be you want to create a metric for a key donor. It might be if the donor has a wealth score or rating of over $100,000, or lives in a wealthy zip code, and has an attachment score of highly engaged or owner, it's a compound, if this or that and this or that, then flag them as donor prospect. That would be a logical expression that would take several fields and create a composite out of it. We do that all the time. Hierarchy geography is a great example. You have a map, you want to see plotting at the, or maybe it's a bar chart of region, and you want to have plotting at the state level, but then you want to drop to the county or the town or whatever. So those are very useful in any dimension that can be grouped at different levels. I added an IP address because in the IT side on security, I want to do a lot of work with IP address calculations. But these are the kinds of transforms that somebody needs to do on top of either the data warehouse or the in-memory MAR to transform this rough data into more useful content. The next thing is predictive modeling. And that will take the metrics that get calculated. For example, if I'm looking at somebody's engagement or attachment, I would probably want to calculate first some expressions out of the data, like how many events from this table have they attended in the last year? Maybe how many events have they attended 2 to 5 years back? How many times have they clicked on a newsletter in the last 6 months? Have they been to a reunion? Did they play student sports? So we do metrics calculations to create those metrics out of the data, then run predictive models to determine the relative weights of those factors in determining whether somebody who has capacity actually makes a gift or not. And then the descriptive part of the modeling would tell you what has the most influence. And it might say, hey, coming to a reunion in the last 5 years has 20% influence on that uplift in actually giving. And that's followed by attending a president's dinner event in the last year. That has a 10%. And that's followed by giving in all 5 of the last years. That's 9%. So it's going to take the potential action and then break it down into these buckets of influence by the factor. So you'll know that if I want to create more engagement or attachment, I've got to get people to coming to reunions, to events, and giving consistently, and we'll rank them and put a score on each of them. That helps you understand. So the modeling is really good at untangling what matters here. What is making a difference? But the predictive side of it is once you get that, the thing creates a score which says, I'm going to take reunion attendance and multiply it by this, and I'm going to take a square of this and add this to it, then I'm going to throw in the events, and then I'm going to throw in the giving. I'm going to create a score that runs from 0 to 1. And the people who are 1 have a higher attachment, and the people who have a 0 are completely disconnected. So now you've taken the metrics, which got calculated out of the raw data off of one of these things. You understand what has influence, and now you've created a score that will score people. And since the thing is set so that it loads on schedule every night, every day these scores are going to update. So if somebody jumped up in this table in events and they came to a reunion, clicked on something, they're going to have a higher attachment score the next day. Then ideally, these predictive modeling scores are embeddable somewhere in the MART or the in-memory or the data warehouse MART so that the metrics get calculated, the scores get recalculated, and the whole thing becomes automated. The next thing is binning and grouping. We talked a little bit up front about parsing the job titles into categories, and then so you want to creatively parse text and group it because there's a lot of dimensions like job title where if you've got 6,000 of them, it's really hard to do anything with. We were working with a nonprofit that ran events, and they were all over the world, and we were able to match out of the titles of the events and group them into Sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa. It was a development firm, organization, NGO. And, Central America and so forth. So that became much more useful. It was the same data over here. It's just seeing like 6,000 events titles is not as useful as saying I want all the events for Northern Africa. So that's a great example of binning the data to create content that's perfectly fine into a much more usable form. Then segmentation based on numeric scores. So we talked about this predictive capability where you get a score that say goes from 0 to 1. Well, most people, they look at a 0.82 and a 0.71. You're going to have an argument. They're going to argue, why is the 0.71 lower than the 0.82, whereas statistically, they're both engaged. So you'd be better off taking the score and breaking into 5 bins and calling them engaged, highly engaged, disconnected, or whatever. And there's no disagreement. These people are engaged. They've both been to a bunch of events. Here's what they did because we see the metrics. So this bidding and grouping is really important because if you throw out a lot of these metrics on their own right, they're really hard for people to understand. Some of them are cross-field, where you want to take maybe, we did the calculation on, the logical calculation of do they have capacity, which is one field. Do they have the zip code's another field. Are they engaged? That's another field. You bring them together, then you want to, after you create that, you want to bin that as well. So you want to know, hey, these are high, medium, or low. The actual scoring, the detail underneath, you want to put them into some kind of a bin. And this also needs to work cross-table, like some of these metrics for the model. You want to go, if you're at the person level, go to the giving table. So you're going from the people table to the gifts table and running a calculation of in the last 5 years, how many of those years did they make a gift? And that's going to put this bin factor in the people table, which is calculated out of the gifts table. So we can go a lot more into detail, but the concept here, high level, is you got to load this data. Then there's a bunch of work somebody's got to do to turn it into useful content. And once you get it, it's a beautiful thing because your team can talk about the high capacity, highly engaged prospects who have been to this event and have an interest in this. Boom, boom, boom. Here's the list of 100. Let's do something with a mailing or something to follow up on them. So the next level of this is outputs. So I think everybody's probably familiar with reporting. Reporting is designed to be structured and consistent, pixel perfect, with pre-calculated indices and formats. It's not designed for slicing and dicing for querying. It's designed for pushing things out. An example would be a financial statement. I mean, the balance sheet is the balance sheet. A grade report. A grade report's a grade report. It's a standard way. You're not going to try to slice it apart. It is what it is. An invoice would be another example. And typically, these systems load into a warehouse which feed a reporting tool, which is critical. You've also data visualization dashboards that come on. So these are where you're trying to see metrics and compare things and see stories in the data. Like a balance sheet, everybody gets a balance sheet. You just see, you don't really visualize a balance sheet. But if you want to look at field office or metrics, you want something that's visual with color and shape, makes it easy to see the patterns. And it's going to be somewhat interactive because you'll want to have some ability, hey, what is this big red thing on my pie chart? Click on it and maybe the list changes. And so these are come on, and dashboards that typically come on with reports and they load together. There's another category, which is data discovery. And the Gartner Group, the Forrester Group, the industry analysts all have a lot of writing on these things, but these are extremely interactive. They're meant to explore anything, anywhere. We'll see an example in a minute. Cross-table and one-to-many relationships, like I want to see people who gave in 2015 and 16, but have not given in 2017. That's a cross-table thing, and it's a one-to-many. And you want to export results off in lists. So this is quite a different front-end output frame than a report would be. And so if you look at these things, typically we also, goes with professional services because some teams have the skills to put this together, but often they don't. So our firm will do this, as a bunch of other firms, the major campaign consulting firms can help you with this, but we always want to start with the questions to be answered before you start putting all these things together. You can use this for strategic context and assessment because, for example, we do a lot of work in this area. So if we're looking at annual giving or major giving and we get this data up like this, we can quickly say, hey, you're great here, you could do better here, those kinds of things. They have to work with this data access and blending side, and often whatever in the warehouse may not have the detail that some of these things need, or the memory mart may need to pull in some of these other tables. The synthesis and modeling needs to be thought through. How you present it, what's an effective display, end user enablement and empowerment and training and support. So I know some teams have the skills to put this thing together, others rely on the outside. And what you see here is typically there's pathing. So the warehouse mart generally drives reports. That's what it's designed to do. The two go together really well. The Inmemory mart generally drives data discovery. They're designed to work together, and they work together really well. And then there's a set of problems that fit these different areas. You know, financial reports, a great example of a report. A campaign dashboard, maybe have some more visuals, but it's basically a report. Field officers are not doing a lot of analysis, so it's sort of a more visual report. It's sort of a cross kind of in the middle. But by the time you get into here, prospect pool and management metrics, usually people want to explore them. They want to drill into them, and they want to slice and dice them, and they want to go from, hey, it looks like we're having a yield problem here to, is the yield problem because we're not moving prospects, or maybe we're asking too much, and what's the issue behind it? That's an exploration. Annual giving, we'll see an example in a minute, is another one, like which appeals are working and why, and are all my non-donors the same, or can I subset who I appeal to with better messaging? What would that look like? That's an analytical task that a report is not well designed for, but these discovery tools are. And prospect identification is trying to create metrics and muck around and slice lists. It happens all the time. So what goes on here is often these get mixed up. And we have a lot of clients who put in a warehouse in some reports, and then they expect the team to do this kind of work with a report. And what happens is you get the cycle of pain. And this comes up all the time. You are trying to slice an annual fund report or dashboard to get a list to call, and you can't because the report was pre-structured in one way and you're exploring it another way. So what happens is somebody submits the request to IT to get the new report or the new query. It's a backlog. It takes 5 days to get the answer. It's not exactly what you expected, so you go back through the cycle again, and everybody gets frustrated. We see this all the time. The other thing that happens is somebody figures out how to download a bunch of data into Excel because they can slice and dice it there. Excel actually is an in-memory mart with a pretty slick front end, but it's one table at a time. So you got to flatten the data. It's time consuming. You don't have all the data. It's hard to show anybody. And then you got this thing, so you keep it. But meanwhile, the CRM keeps changing, and this thing isn't getting the updates because it was so hard to get in the first place. And, you know, that's typically what happens, and we see it a lot. When you misuse this top warehouse reports to do this more interactive discovery stuff. And a better world would be to these very differently designed tools to have both of them and use them appropriately and effectively. And when that happens, you take the cycle of pain and it becomes a collaborative experience. And to show you a quick example, say this is an annual fund campaign, and here's the annual fund director with a couple of her staff. And let's just click on this and open one up. So I'm opening a project. This would have been preloaded the night before. I think it's like 60,000 alumni. It's a few million gift transaction records. It's a few million appeals. And it's going to come up in a dashboard. But it's the data discovery form of the dashboard, so it's extremely interactive, and you can slice and dice it pretty much any way you want. So we're up at, load time is, I don't know what that was, 20 seconds. And we're up and going here. I've got this panel on the left with text I'm going to hide. So I've got a program summary. I've got total participation. My target's 40%. This is an up and running mature program. I know many of you are lower than this, but this is a good target for an up and running multi-year mature program. But it's been declining. It picked up in 13, and then it's sort of falling off. And this year, 16 is not quite done. I've got this year versus last year giving by month. This year is in blue. I've been running pretty good. I'm most of the way through May, and I'm not doing so good in May. I better have a good June because I got to catch up with that. And I've got people who are current donors. There's 25,000 of them who gave but are lapsed, and then non-donors. I've got some breakdowns of the current donors in the 5-year, 4-year. So there's different dimensions here. Do they give consistently in October to December quarter, March through June, summer, winter? Are they variable when they give? Some stats over here. So fairly typical performance dashboard for one of these things. But let's explore it for a second. Now suppose it is May. It's May now. And I'm trying to figure out who are the best people to solicit. Why I might go, let's grab the current donors. These are people who gave last year, but we don't know. They may or may not have given this year, but they gave last year. I click them. Let's get rid of everybody else. And what I see is I've got 25,000 current donors. Some of them are 5-year, 4-year, 3-year. Looks like, hey, 3,892 consistently give well, each of the last 3 years in October through December. That's an interested group. I see up here my participation. They all participated last year because that's who I grabbed. Some of them participated the years before. Roughly 2/3 have given this year. Let's grab the ones that typically give October through December. I click this. So I'm basically just exploring this data, trying to drill in on it. And what I see is, yeah, these guys all gave the last 3 years because that's who I grabbed. They all gave in the December quarter. Looks like 8 or 9% haven't yet given. Who are they? The ones that aren't the current year donors. So I click here. There's 325 of them. So now what I've just done is I took my performance dashboard, which started with the entire program, and I drilled in because it was May. I was running a little behind, and I wanted to figure out, is there a target group I should be focusing on? And it turns out when I grabbed the non-lapsed donors who'd always given October to December, who haven't given this year, there's 325 of them. And you can see they gave last year. A lot of them gave, and some of them also gave a little bit later, but they all gave in that quarter. No blue, no giving this year. Who are they? Go to the entity list. Here's the list of them. So I just loaded from a CRM system. It went into an Inmemory Mart. There are a bunch of binning metrics calculations into an interactive dashboard. On one page, the program summary, I'm not looking at any of the appeals, now the entity list. I got my list to take out and say, let's go. And here they are. I mean, there's some interesting people here. For example, let's just look at this one. Robert Murray is an alum, class of 53, 3-year consecutive. He's given a bunch. He's been given $3,000 to $4,000 a year each year in the December quarter. He missed this year. He is have an annual fund solicitor and some staff on him. Great. And here's my list. I'm like, this is a really good list. There's a lot of $1,000, $10,000, $2,000. There's a lot of money in here. Let's take this list and export it out and open it in Excel. So I dropped it off of my data discovery dashboard. I've now got the list in Excel, and I can give it to my my campaign lead or my communications lead and say, let's go and approach these people and let's get a mailing out to them because they're all consistent. They're just lapsed this year so far, and they missed the December for some reason. And this this could have pulled out emails and other contact information. But that's an example of how something that, let's get out of all this, that could have been a cycle of pain situation, because often the reporting solution or the dashboard is used for this discovery, but annual giving is inherently an interactive discovery. And when you get these things right, you get these really quick, 3 people can sit in a room, like in this example, you kill the cycle of pain, you have this collaborative discussion. Mine was a monologue, apologize for that, but normally it's a collaborative discussion where you get an answer that everybody can buy into and make sense because it's based on the data. Then you go and take action. So one just last point, deployment. When you look at technology, there's a lot of, I'd say, noise about deployment. Where it runs, it seems to be a really hot topic these days. It can run on premise. It can be hosted. Those are probably the 2 options. I would say, this is an IT issue. Do you want to run servers or desktops or wherever this stuff runs? Do you want to prefer to have the data in the cloud and somebody else runs it? It's ultimately, it's the same solution. So we see people get all hung up on this when they're actually missing the point of how am I going to take my CRM and my other data and access it, blend it, synthesize and model and turn it into useful content that my team can consume in an appropriate way. And we've seen examples of basically a pretty inflexible reporting solution hosted in the cloud and driven out to teams to solve all these problems, and it's just not designed to do that. And it could be hybrids. I mean, maybe some of the dashboards and reports can be hosted. Some of the other stuff should be on somebody's desktop because that's a powerful way, and you can muck around and explore and be more analytical there. So we would say be careful getting too caught up in this discussion. And where it gets consumed, either hosted or on-premise, can be consumed in a browser, a desktop, or a mobile device. And that's another issue. We see a lot of push to mobile devices. We're actually doing a lot of research on this. We've surveyed field officers. We've surveyed managers. We've got a couple of pilots and proof of concepts going. And Watch what I say, but the browser desktop tablet has some real advantages. The mobile devices do a lot of things really well, but I think there's more industry push there than there probably ought to be, so I would just urge caution. Mobile devices do things well, but consuming lots of data and interacting with it, it's maybe not the best area. But as a vendor, we're committed to supporting any of these. So our view is, we'll make suggestions, but we'll run with how people want data, consumed and delivered. So as we close out, just to summarize, data gets put in reasonably consistently with CRM systems, and usually there's a bunch of other data sources. The first step is figuring out, how to get it and blend it together. And there's two primary technologies. One's more structured, a little bit heavier, enterprise-wide. The other's more fast, flexible, nimble, lighter, more analytical. Whatever you do with either one of these, you got to do some calculations, presumably some modeling, and you got to do some creative binning and grouping to get the data in a form where people can use it. And then there's three primary deployment: reports, visual dashboards, and this data discovery, highly interactive, and they align towards different problems. And where we see people hitting the cycle of pain is when they take, something designed for more of a reporting and then try to use it for something that's inherently more interactive and more analytical, or vice versa. I mean, some of the tools here aren't particularly good at putting out reports. And I think our better clients have the kind of combinations of these and have aligned the technology appropriately against the problems they're trying to solve, understanding really the questions they're trying to answer and what they're trying to get out of the data. So there's a lot more I could say, but I'm committed to keep this to 30. Looks like I went 35 minutes, and we have room for questions. This will be pushed out. It's been recorded, and there's a whole lot more information on our tutorial page on our website, advisorsolutions.com. Resources, webinars. There's more on annual giving, more on major giving, on major giving metrics, on predictive modeling. There's a whole series of tutorials up there which would add more detail on some of the parts I went through really quick. And you can always reach me. I'd be glad to follow up and have a discussion by either email or phone. So, how are we doing on questions? Yeah, here's one about the platforms. Back up. About this page. It's like, what's the advantage of the hosted offerings versus the on-premise? I guess I would say, functionally, from our software, they're indifferent. If you host with us, the functionality is exactly the same as if you ran it on-premise. Our authoring is desktop, so that would be presumably on-premise, but the deployment would be through browser, iPad, mobile device, whatever. It would be identical either way. I think the issue comes down to data ownership. Like if all the data is on-premise, and especially for working with healthcare data where there's concerns about it leaving the firewall on-premise would almost always be the case. We have situations where so to run on-premise, if you're deploying out to a group, somebody's got to put in a server. We can install it, but it's got to be on a on-premise computer, and it's going to be wrapped in your security, and somebody in IT is going to actually care about this thing. So we have cases where IT is just swamped, and even though a Windows IIS server from what we deploy is pretty simple, they may say, I can't handle this now. So we have a number of clients where we host for an interim period where, we load the data locally and we just run the server in our cloud and set up security and manage it. And that hosted server could come back on premise at some point in the future if the timing is and the desire is there, or it could stay in the cloud. Or conversely, we could start on premise and run to the cloud if the decision was made to move servers off site. I guess what I'm saying is these two are very comparable, and just depends on, who wants to buy the hardware or who wants to make sure the thing keeps running. And, if we're running on premise, we're generally running under the client's security. So it's not a separate security system. Hosted, it generally is because we're in another location. But I think that's probably enough on that. Another question about data. Let me move back to here. I'm going to paraphrase the question. Because something like, is there limits to how much data can be loaded? That's basically how the question comes out. So the answer is theoretically no. A data warehouse is basically a big database, so it's going to have a lot of capacity. I mean, it basically doesn't have a ceiling. An in-memory MART runs in RAM, and it depends how the data is stored. We compress really heavily. So we have clients who can run an author on a Windows desktop, a 16 gigabyte RAM Windows desktop, and have 1,000,005 entities, 25 million gift transactions, 10 million event attendance records, 200 tables, and total of 300 fields or something, and probably 80 or 90 million rows. So, that fits in a desktop footprint. I don't think there's a lot of fundraisers that are bigger than that. So there's no theoretical limits. There is a practical limit with these in-memory MARTs because they are running in RAM. At some point, you've got to have RAM bloat, but it's a pretty high ceiling. And I guess another point on that question I would say is often the warehouse is taking these tables and flattening them and summarizing them, and they may not have all the detail, like all the gift transaction details stored in the warehouse, so they might not have the actual event attendance detail records of the newsletter click-throughs because they're not trying to do analysis, they're trying to push out reports. So they're more formatted, more flattened, probably somewhat reduced. Often, so our in-memory MART can load from a data warehouse. So if there is one, we may grab a bunch of data from the warehouse because it's more structured and it's more flattened and conditioned, so that makes life easier here. But then we're going to want to go grab the details on the clicks, on the gifts and so forth, because you're trying to see trends. And the issue is you're trying to see trends for different slices. So you want to see the giving history of alums from the classes of the 60s who played a sport. Well, the warehouse isn't going to have that because it already structured the data up and doesn't have the detail. But they may have the conditions for the class year, played a sport. That is all up in here. So we can take that, use that as a selection to then show the giving history for that group. And then it might be out of that group, I want to then see everybody who made a gift in 2014, 15, or 16, but hasn't made a gift this year. Well, if we got the gift transaction table, that's a simple selection on one of the charts I showed you in my demo. So that's how these things actually can really work together. So as an in-memory MART, we prefer seeing a warehouse because it gives us a bunch of consistent truth that's already been formatted. And then we can figure out, hey, we need to grab this whole table. We want to grab this table. So we're going to add in some more tables to what's in the warehouse. But then you've got the beauty of the single truth and the analytical flexibility go down. And again, there's not a capacity problem on that. I don't think would be with any of the people on this call. We tried to load Walmart's entire transaction database. It'd be a problem with in-memory, and you wouldn't load it. You'd parse it by time or something. So good question on the data. I appreciate it. Another question on the predictive modeling. To paraphrase this question, it goes something like, is there an advantage to using embedded modeling tools or some of the standard tools like SAS or R? So that would be in here. What about the algorithms? We have on our resources webinar pages, additional webinars in this, but let's categorize it like this. There's R and SAS. R is sort of the de facto open source standard, and SAS is a great company. They make really high-end modeling tools. So those two give you a ton of flexibility. You can do different kinds of models, all kinds of different models. They can be really rigorous models. What we've done is we've embedded modeling into our overall application, so we've bounded it. We have two kinds of algorithms. You can do linear regression or classification. You don't need to know stats. It does a lot of the setup for you. You've got to be able to think through causal factors, and there's a whole other set of things on this. But we're trying to take the stats effort out, basically have no coding predictive modeling, but you lose some of the flexibility, you lose some of the other modeling algorithms that an R or a SAS would have. Then the next question would be, in fundraising, does this matter? I would argue it doesn't, because it is not like you're trying to, stop a nuclear reactor from shutting down if a bunch of signal sensors go off. There's a ton of inputs there, and there's certain combinations that are terrible that you need to do something with, and you want to probably have a bunch of different models with a ton of factors. This is more directional. Like if you're trying to highlight, attachment scores to combine with capacity to find the best prospects, what degree of precision do you need there? What degree of precision is appropriate? And we have seen people spend a lot of money using very rich algorithms. In one case, I think they had 190 modeling factors in basically a major gift donor model. And we generally recommend 6, 12, 15 factors is enough. And I think I actually would argue that 6, 12, 15 modeling factors for something like that may be better, because you don't have enough data depth so if you have 190 factors, you need roughly 25 members in each of the categories within the factor. So if it's one of the factors is, join the President's Club in the last, 2 years, and you need 25 in there. Then if you have another factor that's joined, this specific fraternity, you need to have enough people in there. The problem is the data isn't rich enough to fill all of those things out. So you actually lose, as you get too many factors and too much complexity with not enough data elements, you start losing modeling accuracy. So sometimes, I'm rambling a bit here, but the richer, more complex modeling, like an R or SAS, may actually overfit the problem here, or may create complexity that actually isn't needed and can just cost a lot of money and delay a result and may not give you a better benefit. So there's trade-offs here, and that's sort of, there's a spectrum from our world, which is no coding, don't need stats, need causal understanding, inquisitive mind. You can build models off the data you have to, I can build really, really rich models with a lot of factors. I would argue probably our side of the equation, but I'm probably a little biased there. Other questions? There's a question on setting one of these in-memory marts up. And it sort of goes like, how do you build one? Okay. So a data warehouse or data mart is a DBA or an IT-centric person builds it, because it's got a bunch of like database SQL code and all of that stuff. And you're setting something up that's, it's an enterprise-wide, probably IT-protected solution. And if it's the truth for everybody, you probably want to make sure this is like programmed correctly. So there's a lot of programming and coding in here. These in-memory marts run the gamut. There's high-end marts that look like that. And we have an application, it's basically a desktop app that authors kind of like Excel. So our model is, it's wizard-driven. Somebody who can write Excel macros and has to know something about the data over here, can load these tables in and create all these metrics and calculations and put this thing together. So it's the skill set, and there are others like us, we're focused on Excel-savvy end users to be our authors. These data warehouses and marts are focused on DBAs and IT people. It's a different focus because they're trying to produce reports that are production perfect. Let me back up off of this thing. This one. They're trying to produce these structured, consistent reports. So this is a different game than this, where you've got somebody who knows the data, trying to answer the questions, mucking around in it, writing Excel-like macros to try some new metric, try to load in the click data comes, is it valid or not? I don't know. Let's load it in. Let's link it to the people on email because they both have email. Let's see if there's any patterns between people who click and people who give, or people who click and people who come to events. Really easy to do here, but you don't want an IT person doing that because they're disconnected from the actual problem that's trying to be solved. So these really do appeal to different people groups for all the obvious reasons. And in our world, our authoring is on a Windows desktop, kind of like you'd build an Excel workbook. And you get the workbook done, you save it somewhere. It's a file. It's a big file. It might have like 200 tables from all of this, and it might be a couple hundred megabytes because it's got a lot of data, and it's got all these expressions saved, and it knows how to reload itself and rebuild itself. But that file sits on a server somewhere, and then the author's done with it. It's on some script that tells it, hey, every morning at 3 a.m. reload yourself. It goes back and reloads all this stuff. And then the users come in, move forward a couple pages here. Oops. Yeah, they're coming in by one of these things. If they come in on a browser to our server device, which is on premise, it says, hey, load that file Mary created last night, and you get the experience I showed in the demo. Or maybe an author comes in and grabs a file and loads in a desktop. Now they're running there. They can author it, change it. Hey, maybe they agree on the changes. They save it back over the whatever that master thing is that's loaded, and then tomorrow, all the users get the updates. But that's what we're trying to create here. It's this really easy environment to for the people trying to answer the questions to muck around and answer questions and push stuff out to the team. And we actually, we obviously do, we roll up from, this would probably be our core. We do a bunch of work with field officers, and we could do campaign dashboards with highly visible and interactive. We probably wouldn't do financial reports and the more pixel perfect reporting. We would be rough at that. But on the other hand, the stuff that does this would be rough down here. Here's a question. How do you guys compare with Tableau? The $1 million question. Well, we've studied them fairly heavily. We know them very well. We have another number of accounts that have both Tableau and Advisor. So let me speak to that. Tableau is a visualization tool, would probably fit into this category. It does really well loading more structured data, which is at a warehouse. It can load some of these tables. Its model is to load data to chart it, right? So if you picture, it's grabbing data and it shows in a chart. You can link the charts together, so you've got some interactivity within. They call them dashboards. We call them pages. But it's a different model. Our model is, we're not loading tables into do charts. We're loading a ton of tables into a data pool, and then our charts connect to the data pool. So our model is chart to data. Their model is chart to chart. So our chart to data model means if you bring in all this data and you put a line chart on the gifts table and circle 2015 and 16 on the line chart, you've just grabbed all the gifts from 2015 and 16, which lights up all the people who gave those years, which then goes back and tells you, how many of what events they went to. So maybe you now grab all the people who went to the president's dinner in 16 who also made those gifts. And now you've got, hey, I know that they clicked on things, they were given these appeals. So our chart to data is fundamentally different because our model is you click on something in a chart, it changes the data the chart's attached to, which propagates to all the other data tables because we have them all in our mart. And the entire mesh of tables updates instantly. So if you're doing prospect identification down here, and you're trying to mine between attributes and tables, we can have, often we'll have for them, this is a fairly analytical group, a 30-page, we call it project, called the dashboard, 30 pages. Each page can have 5, 6, 8 charts on it. So now you're representing 200, 250 metrics out of the combination of all of this data. And this prospect researcher can basically click on any attribute from any of the tables, just like the example I did, and all the lists are spinning. At the end, you get the list of people, because this is now subsetted the 100 people exported out. Tableau doesn't do that. They do not have the capability of allowing that level of, let's back up a bit, extreme interaction. They're really up in here, they're sort of in this zone, requiring like more structured data, which they're using to chart. So at one level, we get compared all the time, but we're actually fundamentally different in what we do with the data and how we actually let you interact with it, with the result being it's no problem for us to have a 25-page dashboard with 200 metrics and a whole bunch of charts that you can interact with anything, anywhere, and the whole thing's pivoting on the fly. They just don't do that. We like their market share, market presence, though. And we do have customers that have both of us because they would use maybe Tableau up in here and Advisor down in here. And if you'd like somebody would want to talk with one of them, bring my name back up. You can call me or email me, and I'll be glad to connect you. We have time for a couple more questions. That was a rich one. I'm not sure who asked that one, but got me going there. Here's a question. Is most of your work in major giving or annual giving? You showed an example from annual giving. I would say that our work is probably in this alley here. I'd say we probably do, I'm not going to put a percentage on it, but probably prospect identification is the biggest area we're involved in because it totally fits what we do. We load all this data, create these metrics, you can spin it, slice it, find things, explore it. We do a ton of work in annual giving. Probably comes second because, no, it probably comes third. We probably do second most work in prospect pool management and metrics, where we work with major giving teams. We haven't really seen a good example of that here, but it's to look at are the gift officers connecting with their prospects in a reasonable period of time. And you can calculate that out of, I've assigned these prospects, have there been any visits or meaningful interactions with them in the last 12 months? Yes, okay, what were they? No, hey, why not? Because you want to see, connection like that. Would also here help understand movement through stages. Are we moving consistently through stages, getting stuck? We, out of these factors, can calculate expected ask amounts, because if we know capacity and engagement, we can do a proxy for what the ask should be. Somebody who's worth a capacity of $1 million is highly engaged, and maybe that should be a $200,000 ask. If they're $1 million capacity and they're completely disconnected, maybe a great first ask would be $15,000. That matters, because if I'm trying to close asks and I'm supposed to get $200,000 and I ask 30, I'll probably get it closed, but I just left 270 on the table. And if it should have been 15 and I try to get 100, I'm probably going to have a challenge. So those ask levels, which we can calculate out of this data, coordinate with the pacing of moves through stages and also yield. So they all wrap together, and it's an interactive thing, because it's not like one versus the other, it's together. You want to see good yield with strong asks and good movement and good connection. And if you measure good yield, I guarantee I can get good yield by under asking everybody. I'll hit everyone, but I'll leave a lot of money on the table. So the data over here also really plays in here. And I think generally major giving is the major revenue source of most fundraisers. So probably between prospect identification, helping teams manage the pools, probably the two biggest things. We do a lot of work in annual giving too. The list cutting example I showed a few minutes ago is all the time, but that project also had, let me just back up to it, and then we'll finish up. This page, let's reopen it. This also has a whole bunch of data that's more strategic for annual giving, because it has the appeals, and it has which appeals brought in which type of prospect, and what are my touch points like for these appeals. So that's a more strategic use of the data in annual giving. I'll be up in a second. Good questions, by the way. Yeah, so this is the overall front page of this project. There's a page on segment trends, because the overall participation is composed of retaining the current donors, which this team's doing pretty good on, reacquiring lapsed donors, which is falling off, and acquiring non-donors, which have been pretty good, but it's horrible this year. So I might want to go back over here and grab the non-donors and focus on them, because I'm not acquiring them very well. Let's get rid of everybody else and look at which appeals they've been sent. So here's a page on appeals. It's got a variety of visual views. None of these are going to have great yields, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that have worked, and there's a whole bunch of appeals that had no bearing. So what are these guys? Select them. These class appeals. So there's a program, one of these, that has a whole lot. So actually see what's happening. This gray is all the stuff that I've set that hasn't really worked. these class appeals are sent by a lot of little, like there's a lot of little pieces to them, which means this is a class appeal for one class. So these are probably sent by people who know the non-donor better, and they're having much better results. This green thing here is looks like smaller, more focused appeals. And then I can look at touch points, like, so this is taking the same data and making it more strategic. This chart is showing how many times I'm touching my non-donors, because I've dropped to just them in the last year. A bunch of them I'm not touching. I'm trying to get them between 6 and 12 times with a solicitation touch. Some of them are up at 45, all the gray. The appeals that are working, which is what I selected on the other page, are the colored. So, yeah, I'm not really hitting this group very well with the appeals that are working, and I'm hitting them a whole lot with a whole bunch of stuff that isn't working, which is probably not helping them. And I can sort of see time-wise through the year. Just drop it on this group. Get rid of all the rest of the data here. So across the year, here's the effective appeals. It looks like I start out at the beginning of the year over here with some web thing. Then I got some personalized letters, which are probably those class things. I got the phone calls going in the fall. I take a break in the winter. I do a general letter. There's a lot of stuff going on here with my effective appeals, but it looks like of my non-donors, some of them I'm getting up towards the top, but a lot of them I'm just not touching enough. So this would beg a question, if I kept going, are all my non-donors the same? Or maybe I can subset my non-donors based on the characteristics of the ones I acquired recently. I could use predictive modeling to figure that out. Then take these more effective appeals and send them just to that group to get the touch points up into this 6 to 12 per year band, bring all of these up, and then see if I can get higher acquisition. And just don't focus on the rest of them. Get this group going, turn them into donors, then go get the next group. It's a great example of an annual giving, how we can use this data let me bring it all back, to examine more deeply and then do some strategic work based on who's being acquired by what and what's the touch point level. And this is all data, if I go back to the PowerPoint, that sits in here, and it's just not often brought out in a way you can do this. So as to the question, we do probably the bulk of our work in major giving, but we're doing more and more, and we have quite a good practice going in annual giving with those kinds of things. We often, if we're doing this, we can then take subsets of this and push it out to the field officers and do campaign dashboards and so forth. So we're at the time limit here. A couple more questions. We'll catch them offline. I want to thank you all for participating today, and I hope this was helpful, and we'll have this out to you in recorded form within a few days. Thank you very much.